Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. One of the things that Imam Zayd didn't mention in my qualifications is my studies at Hartford Seminary. My teacher, Dr. Ingrid Manson, from that institution, she's no longer there, is sitting right next to me, and I must acknowledge that part also that contributed to my development. I hope it's one of the good parts, inshallah. The topic that I have received was a global perspective on educational reform. And the good news is that I'm going to stick to the comments that I prepared, but the global perspective is actually also in a microcosm of the Zaytuna perspective. So we'll get the philosophical understanding of what we're doing at Zaytuna as well. If you ask what is the good of education, Plato writes, the answer is easy. That education makes good men, and that good men act nobly and conquer their enemies in battle because they are good. For Aristotle, the best laws, though sanctioned by every citizen of the state, will be of no avail unless the young are trained by habit and education in the spirit of the Constitution. For Bacon, learning is to be entered upon to give a true account of the gift of reason to the benefit and use of men. When the sum total of Aquinas' education brought him no closer to God than he was before, he confessed, "It served not to my use, but to my perdition." A similar sentiment is preserved in the supplication, Allahumma inni as'aluka ilman nafi'an. Oh Allah, I ask you for beneficial knowledge. Given the this diversity in human thought, culture, and tradition, in politics, philosophy, religion, and varied economic, geographic, climate, natural resource, and demographic realities, it is impossible to provide any holistic perspective on educational reform at a global scale without assuming a common thread that runs through all human contexts. That common thread is our human nature, our shared human nature. And that is why an argument in favor of a liberal education as a common foundation for all human beings is so powerful and persuasive. If there is such a thing as human nature, and if our capacity to reason lies at its heart, then the purpose of education must be to help us along the path of realizing our common humanity by cultivating the very faculties that define us essentially. Liberal as a term, when applied to education, intends to make a distinction between slaves and free men, or free people, it's inclusive. Because slaves are trained to perform special functions, they become means to someone else's ends. They are not educated for their own good, but for the use to which they are put. This is why Aristotle divides education into liberal, for the free, and illiberal, for the slaves. If all that education does is provide technical or vocational training, so that one can be employable, without providing any tools to engage how one's specific vocation contributes to or takes away from the greater good, then in a philosophical sense at least, if not in a political and economic sense as well, that education is an education for slaves. But if we are to recognize today that such traditional distinctions, or classical or pre-modern distinctions between classes of men no longer stand, then it follows that the foundation of education for all must be liberal, to prepare them for what may be called their essential vocation as moral and rational human beings, first and foremost, regardless of the trade or profession they choose to enter later in life. Perhaps Hutchins and Adler went too far in their Great Books project when they insisted that no man is educated unless he is familiar with the masterpieces of his civilization. But this axiom was not their invention. Traditional education in all societies was designed to connect students with the best of what had been thought and transmitted from the past, so that solutions for the present and the future could be sought in light of a great and ongoing conversation on the meaning and purpose of life. To be sure, each culture provides its own particular flavor. For example, when the British dismantled systems of traditional learning in India in the 19th century, Gottlieb Wilhelm Leitner, it's Hungarian, principal of the Government College Lahore, pointed out in his study entitled History of Indigenous Education in the Punjab to the year 1882 that, quote, there have been, I'm quoting the analysis of John Baldrige, he writes this in God and Logic in Islam. There have been 7 educational systems functioning in the Punjab before British rule. Islamic using Arabic and Persian, Hindu and Sikh using Sanskrit and classical Punjabi, and other vernacular systems. He argued, that is Wilhelm Leitner argued, that each was a traditional literary educational system, precisely analogous to the curriculum of Latin and Greek classics that formed the basis of most European education at the time. British education, end quote, British educational reforms in India to further a colonialist agenda produced a generation that was not connected to its past, lost in the present, and unable to imagine or shape its future. I think that, as Dorothy Sayers reminds us in The Lost Tools of Learning, in order to go forward, we need to go back. In Karachi, Habib University, for example, who just opened up its doors in the year 2014, this fall, has realized that the answer to the problems that confront Pakistan and the region lie not in building more educational institutions that churn out technocrats and managers and bureaucrats, but to prepare individuals for what they call thoughtful self-cultivation. And I think this dovetails directly with what Professor Ibrahim Musa was speaking to. Because it's on the basis of that thoughtful self-cultivation that you will find creativity and meaningful responses. I can see no other hope for educational reform at a local or global level, or reform of any kind, without engaging the more basic questions of the purpose of life and the pursuit of happiness. If the engines of reform are going to be indicators of economic progress, GDP curves, the exploitation of natural resources with more and more ingenuity, with engineers to build more bridges to nowhere, lawyers to manage disputes over which bridge to build, and doctors to keep us from dying so we can build even more bridges, then the conversation is over before it has even begun. Let me conclude by pointing to Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is very interesting. Which is on education, this particular article. And it appears to be a really confused document to me. But I think it has the right elements, if interpreted and read correctly, which is how I'm reading this. I'm kidding. I'm trying to read it correctly. Who is to say that I read it correctly, but I think we should try to interpret it in light of the philosophical framework that I presented. And I think this can be a basis for educational reform at a global level if invoked and operationalized intelligently. So the article has 3 clauses or 3 points. Number 1, everyone has the right to education. Education shall be free, at least in the elementary and fundamental stages. Elementary education shall be compulsory. And I think this part is speaking to basic literacy. Learn how to read and write. There's nothing more complicated. Then the second part to this first one still, technical and professional education shall be made generally available, and higher education shall be equally accessible to all on the basis of merit. And here I think they're speaking about vocational training, where you have professionals, experts in different fields. No problem. Article 2. Education shall be directed at the full development of the human personality. And I think here is where you get the liberal fabric. the full development of the human personality. Who am I? Why am I here? What is this all for? What is a meaningful life? What ought I do? What are we doing that could be done better? In order to further ultimate ends for my destiny, if I believe that it's in this world, it'll be for the benefit of my children, myself, my family, my community. If I believe there is another world, then it's still inclusive of that, but it's even greater. So education shall be directed at the full development of the human personality and to strengthening of respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. Now they start to get a little political. It shall promote understanding, tolerance, and friendship among all nations, racial or religious groups, and shall further the activities of the United Nations for the maintenance of peace. It's a noble aspiration. The United Nations was just being formed in 1948, and I think we can still keep that spirit with us. And I think that if you unite us on the basis of an education that is common to all human beings, and we engage each other through reasoned discourse, that we can arrive at a better place. The last clause in this article, parents have a prior right to choose the kind of education given to their children. And here I think they're limiting what the state can do. So there is a political element to this document, and these are things that we can discuss further. But I think at the heart of it, which is interesting, it's right at the center, is that education shall be directed at the full development of the human personality. When we look at Zaytuna College, this basically is a paraphrase or a rephrasing of our educational philosophy. And we engage both the Islamic intellectual tradition, but we also engage the Western intellectual tradition. And not to the exclusion of the rest of the world, but there's limits in what you can do. And what we try to emphasize is that the two are not distinct at their core. That they both try to answer common questions, and they both try to arrive at even common answers to some of the basic questions. And so that continuity is something that threads our college, a continuity of intellectual thought across civilizations, and we hope that through this we will create leaders and thinkers who will be creative, innovative, and develop a better world for tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Thank you.